Echoes of the Fallen Realm. Chapter 1. Aiden Hart had his whole life mapped out. At 22, he just graduated with a degree in business accounting, ready to dive into the corporate world, crunch numbers, and climb the ladder to success. The night of his graduation party was supposed to be a celebration of all his hard work. He remembered the crowded room filled with friends, the music thumping through the floor, and the bitter burn of cheap alcohol sliding down his throat. But it was the final drink that changed everything. Someone had dared him to try a strange, glowing bottle with no label, probably some weird homemade brew. The liquid had an odd, metallic taste, but Aiden wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Moments after swallowing it, the room spun harder than any hangover he'd ever experienced. His heart pounded like a war drum in his chest, his vision darkened, and then, nothing. When Aiden opened his eyes, the world was no longer familiar. Gone were the neon lights, the music, and the warmth of his friends. Instead, he found himself staring at a rough wooden ceiling, the faint scent of burning firewood and damp earth filling his nostrils. The bed beneath him was hard and scratchy, nothing like the mattress he'd collapsed onto the night before. His body felt strange, lighter, smaller. Panic surged through him as he stumbled toward a small, cracked mirror leaning against the wall. The face staring back wasn't his own. It was younger, softer, with sharp green eyes and tousled brown hair. He looked no older than 15. Before he could process what was happening, a voice called from outside the room. "Ethan, breakfast is ready." The name echoed in his mind, foreign yet familiar. His legs moved on their own, guiding him into a small kitchen. A woman with kind but tired eyes stirred a pot over a modest hearth, while a young girl, no older than 10, sat at the table, humming as she played with wooden toys. "Sit down, Ethan." "The woman, his mother?" urged softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "You've been sleeping like the dead." Aiden, no, Ethan, felt his heart race. But instead of panicking outright, he played along, answering with cautious nods and simple words, hoping not to raise suspicion. Over the next few days, he watched his surroundings carefully, piecing together clues like a puzzle. The wooden bungalow was small but sturdy, filled with handmade furniture and the faint scent of herbs. The air outside was crisper than anything he'd experienced in the city, and people spoke with a dialect that sounded both archaic and melodic. He spent his mornings helping his mother with their small fruit-selling business, carrying baskets to the village market and handling simple transactions. His mother often grumbled about the poor sales, the rising cost of supplies, and how hard it was without his father around. These small, everyday moments grounded him, but also left him feeling like he was living someone else's life. At first, he thought it might be a dream, or maybe some kind of weird, alcohol-induced hallucination. But the more time passed, the more real it all felt. The rough texture of the fruit baskets, the calluses on his hands from carrying them, and the warmth of his little sister's laughter. It took him a week to finally accept the truth. This wasn't a dream. He had somehow reincarnated into another world, in the body of a 15-year-old boy named Ethan Hart. His father was a soldier fighting at the kingdom's border against monstrous creatures, and his mother was struggling to keep their family afloat. Now, he had to figure out how to survive in a world that was nothing like the one he'd left behind. Chapter 3. The Search for Answers. As the days stretched into weeks, Aiden, now Ethan, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his sudden reincarnation than just a random twist of fate. The family name was the same, Hart, which seemed like more than just a coincidence. Maybe this world and his own were connected somehow. But no matter how much he racked his brain, the name of the kingdom, Renaria, didn't ring any bells from the history lessons he'd half slept through in high school. The customs, the language, even the maps his mother used for their fruit business were all unfamiliar. The mystery gnawed at him. He knew he couldn't stumble blindly in this new life without understanding the world he was in. If he was going to survive and possibly find a way back, he needed information. One evening, as they sat at the small wooden table, the firelight flickering against the walls, he decided to take a chance. "Mom," he began carefully, trying to sound casual. "Do you think I could visit the town library tomorrow? I've been curious about the kingdom, about Dad too. I want to know more about where he's stationed and, how things are out there. His mother paused, her spoon hovering over a pot of stew. Her tired eyes softened with pride, mistaking his curiosity for concern about his father. That's thoughtful of you, Ethan. But you know the rules. You'll have to be home before the town clock chimes 6. Ethan nodded, already expecting the restriction. The evening chime was a warning, signaling the time when everyone needed to be inside. The monsters, twisted, unnatural creatures from who knew where, had been appearing more frequently, especially near the outskirts. The kingdom was struggling to contain them, and their father, like many soldiers, was stationed at the borderlands, fighting to keep the horrors at bay. I'll be back before the chime, he promised. The next morning, after helping his mother sort and prepare the fruit baskets for their small business, Ethan set out toward the town center. The walk through the cobbled streets was both familiar and alien. He recognized faces and places from Ethan's memories, but everything felt like looking at a painting he'd seen once before, blurry at the edges. The town library was a modest stone building nestled between the market square and the old chapel. Inside, the air was cool and thick with the scent of aged parchment and candle wax. Rows of worn wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with scrolls, tomes, and bound manuscripts. A few scholars and villagers sat hunched over tables, their whispers blending with the faint creak of the old floorboards. Ethan approached the nearest shelf, scanning the titles. Most of them were written in the kingdom's native script, which, thankfully, he could read thanks to the strange blending of his own memories with Ethan's. He pulled out a few volumes that looked promising: The History of Renaria, The Border Wars, and Monsters of the Darkened Lands. For hours he pored over the texts, absorbing every detail he could. The kingdom of Renaria had existed for centuries, surrounded by natural barriers like dense forests and towering mountains. The monsters had only started appearing in the last few decades, their origins a mystery even to the kingdom's scholars. No mention of portals, reincarnations, or anything that could explain how he had ended up here. Frustratingly, none of the maps resembled anything from Earth. There were no familiar landmarks, no continents or countries that matched what he knew. It was like this world existed completely apart from his own. But one thing stood out. A passage in the Border Wars mentioned a rise in strange occurrences over the last few years, unexplained disappearances and sudden appearances of people who spoke in foreign tongues or behaved oddly, as if they didn't belong. Ethan's heart raced. Was I the only one who got sent here? Or are there others like me? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the clock tower's heavy chimes echoed through the streets, snapping him from his thoughts. Panic surged through him. He had lost track of time. The 6th chime meant he had only minutes to get home before dark. Slamming the book shut, he stuffed a few notes into his pocket and sprinted out of the library, weaving through the crowded market square. The shadows stretched longer with each passing moment, and the streets began to empty as villagers hurried to their homes. The air felt heavier, as if the very world was holding its breath. By the time Ethan reached his bungalow, his chest was heaving, and his heart pounded in his ears. His mother stood at the door, worry etched deep into her face. His sister peeked from behind her, clutching a worn doll. "You're late," his mother whispered, pulling him inside and bolting the door. "I'm sorry, Mom," he gasped. "I lost track of time." She said nothing more, but the tension in the room was palpable. The distant, eerie sounds of monsters echoed from beyond the village walls, a chilling reminder that their world was far from safe. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, his mind swirled with unanswered questions. Who had brought him here? Why did he share the same family name? And what was the true nature of the monsters his father was fighting at the borders? One thing was certain. If he was going to protect his family and uncover the truth about his reincarnation, he needed to dig deeper and fast. The morning sun peeked through the shutters, casting soft rays across the modest kitchen. Ethan rubbed his eyes and stretched, the lingering questions from the night before still buzzing in his mind. But for now, life moved on. He rolled out of bed and joined his mother, helping her with their usual morning routine, sorting the fruit, checking for any spoilage, and preparing the baskets for the market. Just as he was about to ask if he could head back to the library, his mother wiped her hands on her apron and gave him a weary look. "Ethan, I need you to keep an eye on Lila today," she said, referring to his younger sister. "I'll be in town longer than usual. The fruits are getting smaller, and if I don't figure out why, we might not have enough to sell next week." Ethan bit back his disappointment and nodded. The library can wait, he thought. Besides, spending time with Lila was a good distraction from the overwhelming strangeness of his situation. After breakfast, he took Lila's small hand in his and suggested, "How about we go down to the river? It's warm today." Lila's face lit up. "Really? Can we skip stones?" "Only if you promise not to beat me at it again," Ethan teased, ruffling her hair. They strolled through the familiar dirt path, the sound of birds chirping in the trees overhead. The river wasn't far, a winding stream that sparkled under the sun, its gentle current making it perfect for playing. They spent hours skipping stones, splashing in the shallows, and chasing each other along the banks. For a while, Ethan forgot about the looming monsters, the war at the borders, and his confusing reincarnation. It was just him and Lila, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. By noon, Lila tugged at his sleeve, her stomach growling audibly. "Brother, I'm hungry." All right, he chuckled, standing and brushing off his pants. "Let's head back before you turn into a monster yourself." As they made their way home, the peaceful afternoon air was suddenly pierced by a frantic voice calling out to them. "Ethan, wait up." Turning, Ethan saw Mark, his friend from the village who was a year older. Mark's face was pale, his brow slick with sweat, and his eyes darted nervously around. He looked like he'd been running for miles. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, immediately alert. "I need your help. It's Grandma," Mark panted. "She collapsed on the road, and I can't lift her by myself." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Let's go." Gripping Lila's hand tightly, he followed Mark as they hurried down a narrow path that veered off from the main road. A few minutes later, they came upon a small dirt lane where an elderly woman lay sprawled on the ground, her breathing shallow and labored. Her face was pale, and her frail body looked even smaller under the weight of her thick cloak. It was Mark's grandmother, a woman Ethan had seen around the village, always selling herbs and weaving baskets. Ethan quickly assessed the situation. "Mark, grab her shoulders. I'll take her feet. Lila, stay close." "Okay?" Lila nodded, her eyes wide with worry but staying quiet, sensing the seriousness of the moment. Together, Ethan and Mark carefully lifted the old woman, her weight surprisingly light. Even so, Mark's arms trembled with the effort, and Ethan could feel the strain in his own muscles. "She was fine this morning," Mark muttered, his voice tight with fear. "I don't know what happened. One minute she was picking herbs, and the next, she just collapsed." Ethan frowned. Could it be exhaustion, illness, or something more sinister? The thought of the monsters creeping closer to the village flickered in his mind, but he pushed it aside. First, they needed to get her to safety. "Let's get her back to your place," Ethan said firmly. "We can figure out what's wrong once she's lying down." With careful steps, they carried Mark's grandmother back toward the village, the weight of the situation pressing down on Ethan heavier than the old woman in his arms. "This world keeps throwing surprises at me," he thought grimly, "and I have a feeling it's only going to get worse." Chapter 2. As they carried the old woman through the dusty village streets, their progress was slow and labored. The midday sun bore down on them, making the task even more exhausting. Soon enough, curious villagers began to gather, their voices a flurry of concerned whispers and probing questions. "What happened to her? Is she sick? Was it the monsters?" Ethan could feel the tension rising with every step. The crowd's murmuring buzzed in his ears, making the situation feel heavier than it already was. Mark, his face flushed from both exertion and worry, snapped back curtly, "She collapsed. We need to get her home. Please, let us through." The villagers, sensing the urgency, stepped aside, though their eyes followed them with a mix of concern and fear. The mention of someone falling ill so suddenly sent uneasy ripples through the crowd. In times like these, with monsters lurking and uncertainty thick in the air, any strange occurrence felt like a bad omen. Finally, after what felt like forever, they reached Mark's house, a small wooden structure with a sagging roof but a well-tended garden out front. As they approached, the door flew open, and Mark's grandfather, a wiry old man with sharp eyes and a weathered face, rushed out. "What happened?" he cried, his voice quivering with panic. His eyes darted from his grandson to his wife, lying limp in their arms. "Is she? She collapsed?" Mark gasped, cutting him off. "We don't know why. Help us get her inside, Grandpa." The old man didn't hesitate. Together, they carried her into the dimly lit house, the smell of herbs and dried flowers thick in the air. They gently laid her on a small, creaky bed in the corner of the room. The woman's chest rose and fell weakly, but at least she was breathing. Once she was settled, the weight of exhaustion hit them all at once. Mark wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to Ethan and Lila. "Thank you," he said earnestly. He grabbed a jug of water and poured it into 3 mismatched cups, placing them on the wooden table. From a shelf, he pulled out a small loaf of bread, breaking it into rough pieces. "Here, you two must be starving." Ethan gratefully took the cup of water, gulping it down, feeling the coolness wash away the dryness in his throat. When Mark handed him a piece of bread, he accepted it, but after a quick glance at Lila, who was quietly sitting beside him, her face pale from the long walk and the tension, he gave her his share without a second thought. Lila's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Ethan smiled softly and nodded. "You need it more than I do." Lila hesitated for a moment, then took the bread, her small fingers clutching it tightly. "Thank you, Ethan." Mark, watching the exchange, gave Ethan an approving nod. "You're a good brother." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds in the room being the faint wheezing of Mark's grandmother and the creak of the old wooden floor under Mark's grandfather as he moved restlessly around the room. After a few minutes, Ethan finally spoke, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Has anything like this happened before? Your grandmother seemed healthy when I last saw her." Mark shook his head, worry etched deep into his features. "Never. She's always been strong, even for her age. She said she felt a little tired this morning, but I thought it was nothing." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know what's going on, but something feels wrong." Ethan felt it too, that creeping sensation in the back of his mind that this was more than just an old woman's sudden illness. But what could it be? A disease? A monster attack? Or was it something even more sinister? His gaze drifted toward the window, where the shadows were starting to stretch longer with the afternoon sun. He remembered his mother's warning about being home before the town clock struck 6. The thought of monsters appearing at dusk made his skin crawl. He stood up, gently placing a hand on Lila's shoulder. "We should head home before it gets late." Mark nodded, though he looked like he wanted them to stay. "Thanks again, Ethan. I don't know what I would have done without you." "Don't mention it," Ethan said. "But if anything changes, let me know." As they stepped out into the fading light, Ethan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. The world he'd found himself in wasn't just different. It was dangerous. And something told him that this was only the beginning of the trouble. By the time Ethan and Lila reached their bungalow, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the dusty road. The air felt heavier now, the usual sounds of the village beginning to quiet as people hurried indoors, wary of the approaching dusk and the dangers it brought. As soon as they stepped inside, Ethan went straight to the small kitchen area, his stomach growling despite the tension twisting in his chest. He rummaged through their modest pantry, finding a few potatoes, some dried herbs, and a small chunk of salted meat. It wasn't much, but it would do. Lila, ever eager to help, pulled a stool close to the counter and watched him intently. "I can peel the potatoes," she offered, her small hands already reaching for the dull knife they kept. Ethan smiled softly. "All right, but be careful. Don't cut yourself." Lila nodded seriously, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration as she began peeling. Ethan chuckled to himself, distracted for a moment by her determination. But as he chopped the meat and tossed it into the pot, the creeping worry in his gut returned. Where's Mom? It was almost time for the town bell to chime, the signal that marked the curfew to stay indoors. The bell was both a warning and a reminder. The monsters that lurked outside the kingdom's borders were more active at night, and no one was safe once the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan stirred the pot absently, his mind racing. Their mother was never this late from the market. She knew how dangerous it was. His pulse quickened, and he finally set the wooden spoon down, making a decision. "Lila," he said, turning to his sister, who was now proudly placing the peeled potatoes into the pot. She looked up, her eyes shining with the innocence of someone too young to understand the full danger that surrounded them. "What's wrong?" she asked, sensing the change in his tone. Ethan crouched down to her level, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I need to go find Mom. She should have been back by now." Lila's face fell, fear creeping into her wide eyes. "But what if the monsters come?" "That's why I need you to stay here," Ethan said firmly but gently. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me or Mom. Understand?" Lila hesitated, her lower lip trembling slightly. She looked like she wanted to argue, but instead, she nodded slowly. "Promise you'll come back?" Ethan forced a smile, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "I promise." He gave her a quick hug, squeezing her tightly before standing up and grabbing the small dagger they kept near the door, just in case. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As he stepped out, the bell chimed, the sky had darkened further, and the streets were nearly empty. The village felt eerie, the usual chatter and bustling replaced with silence. The only sound was the distant creak of shutters being locked and doors bolted. Ethan took one last look at the house, seeing Lila's small face peeking through the window before she disappeared to lock the door. He clenched the dagger tighter in his hand and started toward the town square, where his mother usually set up her stall. "Please be safe, Mom," he prayed silently, his footsteps quickening with every passing second. The bell hadn't chimed yet, but he could feel the threat of the night pressing in around him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. Ethan hurried down the road leading to the town, his heart pounding harder with each step. The fading light stretched the shadows long and thin, making the familiar path feel foreign and unsettling. His mind raced with possibilities. Had their mother been attacked? Had something happened in town? He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing only on finding her. The walk felt endless, but his legs didn't tire. Fear and adrenaline kept him moving until finally, the town's entrance came into view. Just as he was about to step into the square, he saw her. His mother stood a few feet from the gates, her basket of fruits spilled beside her, and her shoulders shaking with deep, uncontrollable sobs. The sight of her crying like that sent a sharp, cold ache through Ethan's chest. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he ran toward her. She froze at the sound of his voice, lifting her tear-streaked face. But instead of relief, her sobs grew louder, more anguished. The closer Ethan got, the more he felt an unsettling chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just fear or exhaustion. Something was wrong. Reaching her side, he grabbed her shoulders gently, his breath heavy from the run. "Mom, what happened? Are you hurt? What's going on?" But she couldn't answer. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only more sobs. Her face crumpled, and it was as if the weight of the world pressed down on her all at once. Ethan felt his own throat tighten, memories of his real mother from the world he left behind flashing through his mind. He remembered her comforting smile, her warm hugs, and the pride in her eyes at his graduation party. The last memory before everything changed. Seeing his new mother like this felt like a cruel mirror to the grief he hadn't had time to process. He took a steadying breath, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Mom, let's go home. Lila's waiting for us, and it's almost dark. We can talk there. Okay?" She nodded weakly, still unable to form words, and Ethan gently helped her to her feet. He picked up her scattered things, slinging the basket over his shoulder. The weight of it was nothing compared to the heaviness in his heart. They walked in silence, the only sound being his mother's occasional sniffles and the soft crunch of their footsteps on the dirt road. The sky was darkening fast, and Ethan's eyes kept darting to the shadows, half expecting to see something monstrous lurking. But nothing came. The real monster seemed to be whatever had shattered his mother so completely. When they finally reached their village, Ethan's eyes shot to their bungalow, where a familiar face peeked nervously through the small window. Lila had been waiting just as he'd told her, her little face pale but patient. The moment she saw them, her eyes widened in relief. She disappeared from the window, and by the time they reached the door, she was already there, fumbling with the lock. As soon as the door swung open, Ethan guided their mother inside, careful and gentle, as if she might break. Lila rushed to their mother's side, her small hands clinging to her arm. "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" But their mother just shook her head, tears still streaming down her face. Ethan helped her sit down on the old wooden chair by the hearth, setting her basket aside. She slumped forward, her hands covering her face, and the sound of her muffled sobs filled the small room. Ethan knelt beside her, exchanging a worried glance with Lila. He placed a hand on his mother's trembling back. "Mom," he said softly, "we're home now. You're safe. Please, tell us what happened." But the words hung in the air unanswered, and Ethan could feel that whatever had happened in town, it was something far worse than he had imagined. Chapter 3. The small room felt heavy with silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and their mother's quiet sobs. Lila clung to her mother's arm, her wide eyes brimming with confusion and fear. Ethan sat beside them, his heart pounding as he waited, hoping his mother could find the strength to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, their mother's sobs softened enough for her to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Your father?" she began, her voice cracking, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. She covered her face again, shaking her head as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Ethan felt a cold dread settle over him. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, trying to keep his voice calm, though his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. "Mom, what about Dad? Is he hurt?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she forced herself to continue, her voice breaking with every word. "Your father went missing," she whispered. "During a short break from the battle. They said he had wounds all over his body, but when they went to check on him, he was gone." Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. Missing? His father wasn't just wounded, he was gone. He swallowed hard, trying to process what that meant. But his mother wasn't finished. "Not just him," she added, her eyes distant with fear. "Several men, they disappeared too. They were resting, injured. And then, her breath hitched. They were just gone. No one knows how or why. The news spread today, and now people from the surrounding villages. They're terrified." Lila gasped softly, burying her face into their mother's side. Ethan sat back, his mind reeling. Disappearing soldiers? This wasn't just a simple battle wound or a missing person. Something strange was happening. Something that made even the most hardened villagers shiver with fear. Ethan clenched his fists, pushing down the growing panic in his chest. He couldn't let fear take over. His family needed him. "Mom," he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "I'm going to find out what happened. I'll go to town tomorrow and see if I can learn more about Dad and the others." His mother's eyes widened, shaking her head quickly. "No, Ethan. It's too dangerous. If something out there is taking soldiers, I won't lose you too." "I'll be careful," Ethan promised, his voice firm but calm. "I just need to know more. I'll talk to people, ask around. Maybe someone knows something they're not telling yet." His mother hesitated, torn between fear and hope. Finally, with a shaky sigh, she nodded. "You have to come back before dark. Promise me, Ethan." "I promise," Ethan said, squeezing her hand. Lila peeked up at him, her small face pale and worried. You'll come back, right? Ethan leaned down and ruffled her hair gently, forcing a smile he didn't feel. Of course I will. I'm not going anywhere. But as he stared into the flickering fire that night, long after his mother and sister had fallen asleep, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse than a simple disappearance was at play. And tomorrow he would find out no matter what. Ethan woke before dawn, the house still cloaked in shadows. His mother and Lila were fast asleep, their breathing soft and steady in the quiet. For a moment, he lingered by their sides, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. I'll find out what happened, Dad, he promised silently before slipping out into the cool morning air. The road to town stretched ahead, a thin ribbon of dirt bathed in the dim light of early dawn. Ethan walked briskly, his breath visible in the morning chill. As he moved, he noticed other villagers joining the path. Men, women, even older children, all making their way toward the town. Their faces were marked by the same mix of fear and uncertainty that gripped him. Some whispered anxiously about the news from the day before. Voices hushed as if afraid the mere mention of the missing soldiers would summon more misfortune. Others stayed silent, their expressions grim, especially those whose fathers, brothers, or sons were among the disappeared. The fear of the unknown lingered in the air like a thick fog. By the time Ethan reached the town gates, the morning sun had begun to rise, casting golden light across the cobblestone streets. But the warmth of the sun did little to ease the tension. The town square was already crowded, people gathering in groups, exchanging hushed conversations, wild rumors, and desperate theories. Ethan moved through the crowd, stopping here and there to ask questions. Most people knew nothing more than what his mother had already told him. A few mentioned strange sightings near the borders, shadows moving in the dark, strange sounds at night, but no one had any solid answers. The longer he searched, the more frustrated he grew. Where do soldiers just vanish to? He wondered, glancing around at the sea of worried faces. Then, just as Ethan was about to give up and head home, the town bell rang out, its loud, echoing chimes silencing the crowd instantly. But this time, it wasn't the usual warning against the approaching monsters. The tone was different, clear, sharp, and commanding. A royal decree was about to be announced. People pressed closer to the center of the square, their eyes fixed on the raised platform where a town official, clad in the kingdom's colors, unrolled a scroll sealed with the king's emblem. His voice rang out over the hushed crowd, heavy with authority. By order of His Majesty, King Verrick of the Kingdom of Renaria, the man began, his voice carrying across the square. It is with great urgency that we address the grave threats facing our kingdom. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but the official continued without pause. The beasts at our borders remain unbeatable, their numbers growing with each passing day. Our brave soldiers fight valiantly, but the disappearance of many has weakened our defenses. Ethan felt his stomach twist at the mention of the missing soldiers, his father's face flashing in his mind. Therefore, the man's voice grew louder. It has been decreed that all young men aged 14 and older shall be mandated to join the army. They will undergo 1 month of training before being sent to reinforce the front lines. For a moment there was silence, the kind that sinks deep into your bones, leaving you cold even in the sunlight. Then the crowd erupted. Shouts of protest and fear echoed across the square. "My son is only 15, a woman cried, clutching her boy to her side. "This is madness," another man shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "They're just children." But the official raised his hand, demanding silence. Failure to comply will be seen as treason against the crown. The kingdom's survival depends on the bravery of its people. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. At 15, he was exactly the age they were calling for. He thought of his mother's tear-streaked face, of Lila's small hand clutching his sleeve. He'd promised to come back home. But now, even that wasn't certain. The weight of the decree settled over the town like a dark cloud, and as the crowd began to disperse, Ethan knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change forever. As Ethan stood amidst the dispersing crowd, the town official raised his voice once more, delivering additional instructions that gripped Ethan's heart even tighter. Each family of the conscripted young men will receive a monthly food supply provided by the crown, the official announced. The first supply will be distributed 2 days from now, before the boys depart for their training. A collective murmur rippled through the villagers, some expressing relief at the support, others still drowned in dread over the fate of their children. The kingdom of Renaria holds enough treasures to sustain these supplies for as long as the battle against the monsters rages, the man continued. When the war is won, all those who fought will be rewarded and honored as heroes of the kingdom. Ethan barely registered the last words. His thoughts had already drifted back to his mother and Lila waiting at home. The promise of food and honors couldn't outweigh the fear gnawing at his chest. Without waiting for further details, Ethan turned and began his trek back to the village, his footsteps heavy on the dirt path. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like omens of what was to come. As he walked, his mind raced, replaying the decree over and over. 2 days. 2 days and everything changes. When Ethan finally reached their small bungalow house, he found his mother in the kitchen, slicing what little fruit they had left while Lila hummed softly by the window, her small hands busy with a piece of cloth she was trying to sew. The warmth of home felt fragile, as though it could shatter with the news he carried. Ethan stepped inside, his presence immediately drawing their attention. His mother's eyes lit up with relief, but it quickly faded as she saw the seriousness etched across his face. "Ethan?" she asked, setting the knife down slowly. "What did you find out?" Lila stopped humming, her eyes wide as she turned to him. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "Mom, there's a decree. All boys aged 14 and older are being mandated to join the army. We're to train for a month before going to the front lines." For a moment, the room was silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then his mother's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, her face crumpling as she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, no, not you too," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I can't lose you, Ethan. Not after your father." Ethan rushed to her side, kneeling beside her chair and taking her trembling hands in his. "Mom, listen," he said gently, his voice firm despite the ache in his chest. "I don't want to leave, but they're giving us 2 days to prepare. They'll provide monthly food supplies for you and Lila. You won't have to worry about surviving while I'm gone." But his words did little to soothe her. She shook her head more violently, her sobs growing louder. "I don't care about the food, Ethan. Care about you. What if you never come back? What if I lose you and your father both?" Ethan felt his own tears sting at the corners of his eyes, but he forced them back. He had to be strong for her, for Lila. "I'll come back, Mom," he promised, squeezing her hands. "I'll find Dad, and we'll come home together. I believe he's still out there. I have to believe that." From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Lila standing silently, her small frame tense, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. She approached slowly, her voice a fragile whisper. "Brother, do you really have to go?" she asked, her lower lip trembling. Ethan turned to her, pulling her into a hug. "Yes, Lila. But while I'm gone, I need you to take care of Mom. Be her little helper. Okay?" Lila sniffled but nodded, burying her face in his chest. "You have to come back," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Promise me, big brother." He kissed the top of her head, holding her tightly. "I promise. And maybe I'll bring Dad back with me." They sat together like that for a long time, the afternoon light casting a soft glow around them. Eventually, their mother, though still weeping, nodded in reluctant acceptance. "Even if I don't agree," she whispered hoarsely, "it's a royal decree. No one can fight it. But promise me one thing, Ethan. Stay safe. Whatever happens, stay safe." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy with both fear and determination. "I will, Mom." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over their small home, Ethan knew their lives had already begun to change. But no matter how dark the path ahead seemed, he was determined to find his father, protect his family, and somehow survive the trials that awaited him in the kingdom of Renaria. Chapter 4. The 2 days passed by like a fleeting breeze, leaving little time for Ethan and his family to truly prepare for what lay ahead. The weight of the impending departure hung heavy in the air, each moment saturated with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. On the morning of departure, the town center was a flurry of activity. Boys from all over the village, some barely older than Ethan, others young men stepping into adulthood, lined up to register their names. The town, usually buzzing with the cheerful sounds of merchants and villagers, was now thick with tension. The king's subordinates and soldiers, clad in the royal insignia of Renaria, moved efficiently through the crowd, distributing monthly supplies to the families left behind. Large sacks of grain, salted meats, and other necessities were handed out in an attempt to ease the blow of separation. The same scenes unfolded across villages and towns throughout the kingdom as the decree reached every corner of Renaria. Ethan's mother and Lila had walked to town early that morning to receive their supplies. The weight of the provisions in their arms was nothing compared to the heaviness in their hearts. As they clutched the goods, they moved towards the center of town where the boys gathered, hoping for one last glimpse of Ethan before he left. All around them, the air was filled with tears and loud sobs. Mothers clung to their sons. Fathers placed heavy hands on their children's shoulders, offering silent words of encouragement. They struggled to believe themselves. Younger siblings wailed, their innocent cries echoing off the stone walls of the town square. The pain was universal, yet every family felt it as their own unique tragedy. Ethan stood with Mark and a few other friends from the village, their faces pale under the morning sun. The once familiar streets now felt foreign, overshadowed by the looming march toward an uncertain future. Ethan tried to keep his face stoic, but the memory of his mother's broken sobs and Lila's tear-streaked face haunted him. As the signal horn blared, calling the new recruits to formation, Ethan caught sight of his mother and sister at the edge of the crowd. His mother's face was a mask of grief, but she stood tall, clutching Lila's hand tightly. Lila's eyes met Ethan's, her small form trembling as she waved at him, her lips mouthing silently, "Come back." Ethan swallowed hard, raising his hand in return, his heart aching in his chest. "I will come back," he promised silently, his gaze locking with his mother's. "And I'll find Dad." The march began. Boots pounded against the dirt roads as the boys made their way out of town, flanked by seasoned soldiers leading them to their respective camps for training. The sound of shuffling feet and the occasional sniffle were the only things breaking the otherwise somber silence. Some boys couldn't shake their fear, their faces pale and eyes darting nervously. Others wore expressions of bravado, puffing out their chests to mask the terror bubbling beneath the surface. A few remained nonchalant, their faces blank, emotions locked away where no one could see. Ethan walked alongside Mark, their shoulders brushing in silent solidarity. Mark's jaw was clenched tight, his usual easy grin nowhere to be found. Behind them, their other friends from the village trudged along, each lost in their own thoughts, but united by a shared uncertainty. As they reached the outskirts of their village, Ethan couldn't resist the urge to look back one last time. The familiar sight of their homes, the towering trees lining the roads, and the faint figures of their families waving in the distance made his heart squeeze. "We'll come back," Mark muttered beside him, his voice low but firm, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Ethan nodded, gripping the small pendant his father had given him before leaving for the front lines. It was a simple piece, but it now held the weight of both hope and promise. "We have to," Ethan whispered back. The road ahead was long, and the future uncertain, but one thing was clear in Ethan's heart. No matter the battles, no matter the monsters or the dangers waiting beyond, he would fight not just for the kingdom of Renaria, but for his family, for his father's return, for his mother's smile, and for Lila's laughter to fill their home once more. As the boys disappeared into the horizon, the town behind them faded into a distant memory, but the promises made that day would burn brightly in their hearts for as long as they drew breath. The march was long and exhausting, The once eager pace of the boys had slowed to a weary shuffle, their feet dragging through the dirt as the sun dipped lower in the sky. They took a few short breaks, collapsing onto the grass or leaning against trees to catch their breath. But before long, the commanding officers barked at them to get moving again, their voices sharp and unforgiving. By the time they reached the training camp, the sky had turned a deep crimson, and the first stars blinked faintly overhead. The camp was sprawling, surrounded by wooden palisades and filled with rows of barracks and training grounds. The boys stared at the looming structures, their exhaustion mixing with anxiety about what lay ahead. As they entered, they were herded into a large open space where officers handed out training clothes. Simple, rough-spun tunics and trousers, sturdy enough to endure the harsh days to come. Each boy clutched his new uniform tightly, the reality of their situation sinking in deeper with every passing moment. "Eat, rest," one of the officers barked, his voice as cold as the evening air. "Tomorrow begins your training, and it won't be kind. You'll need all the strength you can muster." The boys were led to the mess hall, a long wooden structure filled with the smell of stew and bread. The meal was simple, thick, bland porridge with a small piece of bread. But after the grueling march, even the plain food felt like a feast. Ethan sat quietly, his muscles aching, his mind racing with thoughts of home and his family. After dinner, they were directed to their sleeping quarters, long barracks that housed 10 boys each. Ethan found himself assigned to a room with his friend Lucas, a quiet boy from their village with sharp eyes and a thoughtful demeanor. Mark and the others were placed in another barack nearby, their disappointed glances exchanged as they were separated. The barracks were sparse, with rows of rough wooden bunks covered by thin blankets. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat and dirt, a stark reminder of the long journey they had endured. As the boys settled into their spaces, the room buzzed with the soft murmur of voices. Some gathered in small groups, huddling together to exchange greetings and names, trying to forge quick connections in this unfamiliar place. Ethan and Lucas found themselves in one such group, introducing themselves to boys from distant villages and towns across Renaria. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices tinged with nervousness and curiosity. Others, however, went straight to their bunks, pulling their blankets over their heads, unwilling or unable to socialize. The weight of the day had drained them of any desire for conversation. A few boys, perhaps trying to mask their own fears, began to boast about their towns and villages, spinning tales that made them the heroes of their own stories. One boy from the northern hills claimed to have fought off a wild boar with nothing but a stick, while another from the riverlands boasted about swimming across a raging river to save his younger brother. The stories brought a few laughs, but the underlying tension in the room was impossible to ignore. No matter how grand the tales, everyone knew that the true test lay ahead, and no amount of boasting could change that. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself staring at the wooden beams above his bunk, his mind drifting to thoughts of home. He could still picture his mother's tear-streaked face, Lila's small hand waving at him as he marched away. The promise he made to them echoed in his mind. "I'll come back. I'll find Dad." Beside him, Lucas shifted in his bunk, breaking the silence. "Do you think it'll be as bad as they say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft snores of the other boys. Ethan stared into the darkness for a moment before replying. "Worse, probably." Lucas let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Yeah, probably." As the night deepened, the camp grew quiet, the only sounds the distant crackle of torches and the occasional hoot of an owl from the nearby woods. Ethan finally closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would be the beginning of something none of them could truly prepare for. The hellish training awaited. Chapter 5. As Ethan closed his eyes, the exhaustion from the day's march pulled him into a deep, restless sleep. But instead of finding peace, his mind drifted back to a life that now felt like a distant memory. A life where the air wasn't thick with fear and sweat, and the weight of survival didn't hang over every decision. He found himself walking down familiar streets, lined with bustling cafes and the sound of traffic humming in the background. His backpack slung over one shoulder, he laughed with his friends as they made plans for the weekend. plans filled with movies, video games, and late-night snacks. He could almost taste the greasy burgers from their favorite diner and hear the familiar clink of glasses as they celebrated nothing in particular. It was a life of comfort, of routine, of simple joys. Those times were really fun. For a fleeting moment, Ethan felt a sense of warmth in his chest, almost forgetting the cold, hard reality he now faced. But then, the vivid colors of his past life began to blur, the laughter fading into an eerie silence. Suddenly, his dream was shattered by a loud, piercing shout. "Wake up! All of you up!" The harsh voice echoed through the barracks like a thunderclap. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding against his ribs. The dim light of dawn crept through the small windows, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick and stale, filled with the mingled sense of sweat, dirt, and fear. Boys scrambled from their bunks, some still half asleep, others wide-eyed with panic. Ethan threw off his blanket and quickly pulled on his training clothes, his body still aching from the march but knowing there was no time to dwell on it. "Outside! Now!" Another voice barked, and the boys stumbled into the cold morning air, their breath visible in the chill. The training grounds were already bustling with activity. Rows of soldiers and instructors waited, their stern faces offering no comfort. The boys were lined up, their numbers stretching far into the field, each one bracing for what was to come. The first session began with grueling exercises, running laps, push-ups, and carrying heavy logs across the field. The instructors shouted commands relentlessly, pushing them beyond their limits. Ethan's muscles screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving, each drop of sweat a testament to his determination. Around him, some of the weaker boys began to stumble. One boy collapsed during the sprints, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Another vomited behind a tree after failing to complete a set of push-ups. The air was thick with the odor of exertion, mingling with the faint, sickly smell of fear. Ethan glanced around, spotting Lucas a few paces away, his face flushed and jaw clenched. After what felt like hours, the instructors finally called a halt. The boys were herded toward the mess hall, their bodies dragging with exhaustion. Sweat clung to their skin, soaking through their clothes, and some boys leaned on each other for support as they shuffled inside. The smell of food hit them as they entered, but instead of relief, it made a few boys gag. The combination of body odor, sweat, and the rich, greasy smell of porridge was overwhelming. A boy near Ethan suddenly heaved, his breakfast from the day before splattering onto the floor. Another boy slumped over the table before even touching his food, his body giving in to the fatigue. Ethan forced himself to eat, every bite feeling like a chore. His mind wandered back to his dream, to the world he had left behind. A world where his biggest worry had been an upcoming test or a missed bus. The contrast was almost too much to bear, but he knew he couldn't dwell on it. This was his reality now. The monsters were real, the danger was immediate, and the only way to survive was to push forward. As he swallowed the last bite of his bland porridge, Ethan made a silent promise to himself. "I'll get through this. For Mom, for Lila, and for Dad." The road ahead would be tough, but he wasn't going to let this world break him. After a meager breakfast and a short, restless rest, the boys were once again herded into the training grounds. The morning sun had risen higher, but its warmth did little to ease the tension in the air. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, still feeling the ache in his muscles from the earlier session. There was no time to recover. This was just the beginning. "Line up!" barked one of the instructors, his voice sharp and commanding. The boys quickly scrambled into formation, standing shoulder to shoulder in long, uneven lines. The instructors, clad in their gleaming armor, paced in front of them with stern expressions, their eyes scanning the crowd like hawks. One of the instructors, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You will be divided into groups," he announced, his voice carrying over the restless murmurs of the crowd. "Each of you will learn the fundamentals of combat, whether it be with the sword, bow and arrow, long spear, or even the rare art of spell casting. A ripple of excitement and anxiety swept through the boys at the mention of spell casting. Magic was a mysterious and unpredictable force in Renaria, and not everyone was capable of wielding it. But even the slightest chance of possessing magical abilities sparked a sense of hope in some, while filling others with dread. Not all of you will be able to cast spells, the instructor continued, as if reading their thoughts. But every one of you must learn the basics. You may not know it yet, but some of you might have hidden potential. And if you do, it could mean the difference between life and death. The boys exchanged uneasy glances. The reality of their situation was sinking in fast. Over the next few days, the instructor went on, you will rotate through each of the disciplines. You will train with the sword, archery, the spear, and you will practice the rudiments of magic. Once you've learned the basics, you will choose the weapon or skill that suits you best, where your strengths lie. With that, the instructors began calling out names, assigning the boys to their initial training groups. Ethan found himself grouped with Lucas and a few unfamiliar faces. They were assigned to start with sword training. Mark and some of the other boys from their village were sent to the archery group, while a few others were directed towards spear training. Only a small handful were led towards the spellcasting section, their faces a mix of nervousness and excitement. As they moved to their designated areas, Ethan gripped the wooden training sword handed to him. It felt awkward and unfamiliar in his hand, nothing like the smooth, sleek objects from his old life. But he knew he had to adapt. There was no room for hesitation here. The sword instructor, a burly man with arms like tree trunks, demonstrated the basic stances and swings. Feet apart, knees slightly bent, he barked. Grip the sword firmly, but don't strangle it. Feel the weight. Let it become an extension of your arm. Ethan mimicked the stance, feeling the strain in his already tired muscles. As they practiced their swings, the repetitive motion sent sharp jolts through his arms, but he clenched his jaw and pushed through. The hours dragged on, each swing blurring into the next. Around him, some boys fumbled with their swords, their faces twisted in frustration. Others gritted their teeth, determined to master the technique. Lucas, though smaller in stature, showed surprising agility, his movements swift and precise. When the instructors finally called for a break, Ethan dropped to the ground, his arms trembling. "This is just the beginning," Lucas muttered, collapsing beside him. Ethan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. His thoughts drifted to Mark and the others. He wondered how they were faring with archery and spear training. And what about those in the spellcasting group? Were any of them showing signs of magic? After a brief rest, the boys were rotated to their next training discipline. Ethan was now handed a bow, its string taut and unyielding. Drawing it back felt like trying to bend steel, and aiming was an entirely different challenge. The instructors guided them through the motions, but hitting the target was a struggle for most, including Ethan. By the time they reached spear training, Ethan's body was screaming in protest. The long weapon felt heavy in his arms, and the thrusting techniques required a different kind of precision and balance. But Ethan pushed through, fueled by the image of his mother and Lila waiting for him at home. Finally, it was time for the spellcasting basics. The group was led to a secluded area where an elderly mage awaited them. His robes were tattered, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "Magic," the mage began, "is not something you control with sheer force. It is an extension of your will and spirit. Some of you may feel its call, others may not, but all of you must learn to listen." The mage guided them through meditative exercises, teaching them to focus on their breathing and inner energy. Ethan felt nothing at first, just the familiar ache of exhaustion and the pounding of his heart. But as he closed his eyes and concentrated, he felt a faint tingle in his fingertips. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Was it real, or just his imagination? By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the boys were exhausted beyond words. They trudged back to their quarters, their bodies sore and their minds overwhelmed. Ethan and Lucas took a short rest and decided to take a quick bath. Their sweat is sticking to their body and making them uncomfortable. The others weren't able to stand, so they just slept after dinner. After the bath, they went back in the barracks. Ethan collapsed onto his cot, staring at the wooden ceiling above. The day had been brutal, but he knew it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, they would have to master these skills and choose their path. Whatever came next, he had to be ready. "I have to survive this," he whispered to himself, closing his eyes. For his family, for his father, and for the hope of returning to the life he once knew. The next day, before the first light of dawn, the loud, piercing sound of a horn echoed through the camp, followed by the sharp shouts of the instructors. "Up! On your feet! Move!" Groans filled the room as the boys, still aching from the previous day's grueling training, dragged themselves out of their straw-filled cots. Ethan felt like his body had turned to stone. His muscles screamed in protest with every movement. But there was no choice. The demands of survival outweighed the comfort of sleep. As they stumbled out into the cold morning air, their breath visible in the chilly dawn, Lucas, Mark, Fisher, and Silver found Ethan in the crowd. Their faces were etched with fatigue, but a glimmer of determination shone in their eyes. "Still breathing, huh?" Mark muttered with a weak grin as they began their morning run. "Barely," Ethan replied, forcing a chuckle. The weight of the sacks they carried on their backs felt twice as heavy as the day before, but the camaraderie between them made it bearable. They ran through the muddy fields, hauled logs twice their size, and practiced coordinated drills under the ever-watchful eyes of their instructors. The morning air was thick with the smell of sweat and effort. By the time they were dismissed for breakfast, most of the boys could barely stand straight. They trudged to the mess hall, collapsing onto the benches as steaming bowls of porridge were placed in front of them. "Did you guys hear?" Fisher whispered between bites, his eyes darting around as if sharing a secret. "Some of the guys in the mage group managed to cast their first spells yesterday." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? Already?" Silver nodded. "Yeah. One kid from Hallowbrook made a flame the size of his fist. But I heard it drained him so bad he nearly passed out." Ethan listened quietly, remembering the faint tingle he had felt during their first spellcasting session. It was a fleeting sensation, but it had stirred something deep inside him. After breakfast, the boys returned to their respective training groups. This time, something had shifted for Ethan. Whether it was the exhaustion forcing his body to adapt or a newfound focus, he found himself improving rapidly. In sword training, his grip felt stronger, his swings more precise. The instructor even gave him a rare nod of approval, something Ethan hadn't seen given to many others. Lucas, though still struggling with the bow, showed remarkable skill with the spear. His quick reflexes and natural balance made him stand out among the other trainees. Mark and the others were still finding their footing, but the progress was noticeable. When they rotated to archery, Ethan struggled once again. No matter how hard he tried, the bowstring felt awkward in his hands, and his arrows rarely found their mark. Meanwhile, Lucas managed to hit a few targets, his confidence growing with each successful shot. "Guess I'm not a born archer," Ethan muttered, watching another arrow sail wide of the target. "Yeah, but you're killing it with the sword," Lucas replied, clapping him on the back. "We've all got our strengths." Next came spear training. This time, Ethan found himself clicking with the weapon. The weight felt natural, and he quickly grasped the basic attack patterns. The spear's reach and precision appealed to him, and his instructor noticed his swift adaptation. But it was the mage training that everyone was most excited about. The boys buzzed with anticipation as they gathered around the elder mage again, eager to see if any hidden talents would emerge. The mage, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light, addressed the group. "Magic requires not just focus, but an understanding of your own energy. Yesterday, some of you felt its call. Today, we'll see who can truly wield it." Ethan took a deep breath, closing his eyes as he tried to tap into that strange sensation from the day before. The world around him faded as he focused inward. At first, there was only silence, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat echoing in his ears. But then, there it was, a faint warmth, like a flickering ember in his chest. He pushed deeper, concentrating harder. The warmth grew, spreading through his limbs until it became an intense heat. Sweat trickled down his temples as the sensation intensified, his body trembling from the effort. The mage's voice cut through his concentration. "Good. Now, open your eyes and release it." Ethan's eyes snapped open, and instinctively, he thrust his hands forward. A small, bright light burst into existence before him, hovering in the air. The other trainees gasped, their eyes wide with awe. But the light didn't stop growing. It expanded rapidly, illuminating the entire room with a blinding brightness. The elder mage stepped forward, his face a mix of shock and admiration. "Incredible," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. But before Ethan could process what was happening, a wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to tilt. "Ethan!" Lucas shouted, rushing forward. But it was too late. The last thing Ethan saw was the concerned faces of his friends before everything went black. When Ethan regained consciousness, he was lying on a cot in what appeared to be the infirmary. The room smelled of herbs and faint smoke. His body felt heavy, but his mind was sharp. The elder mage sat beside him, a curious smile playing on his lips. "You've shown great potential, boy," the mage said softly. "But magic comes at a cost. You must learn to control it, or it will control you." Ethan nodded weakly, his thoughts racing. He hadn't just discovered a new ability. He had unlocked something that could change the course of his life in this strange, medieval world. But with great power came even greater responsibility. And Ethan knew his journey was only just beginning. Ethan groaned softly as he tried to lift his body from the cot. His muscles felt like they were made of lead, every fiber of his being protesting the movement. The residual heat from the spell still lingered faintly in his limbs, a reminder of the raw power he had tapped into. "Easy there," the elder mage murmured, gently placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder to steady him. His eyes gleamed with both amusement and respect. "Magic isn't just about strength. It's about balance. You've got the power, but your body isn't used to channeling it yet." Ethan exhaled, leaning back against the cot's rough wooden frame. "I felt like I was going to burn up," he admitted, his voice hoarse. The mage chuckled softly. "That's normal for beginners, especially for someone like you who seems to have a natural affinity. But remember, magic draws from both the mind and the body. Overexertion can drain you more than any physical labor." He stood up, smoothing his robes as he gave Ethan a knowing look. "For now, eat, rest, and—" He sniffed, his nose wrinkling slightly in mock disgust. "For the sake of those around you, bathe. It'll help with the fatigue." Ethan chuckled weakly, realizing with some embarrassment that he hadn't bathed properly in days. The exhaustion from the training had left little room for anything beyond sleep and survival. When Ethan finally stepped out of the infirmary, he was greeted by the grinning faces of his friends. Lucas, Mark, Fisher, and Silver stood waiting, their expressions a mix of relief and teasing mischief. "Look who's alive," Mark called out, patting Ethan on the back. "Or should I say, our resident mage? Yeah. Don't go turning us into frogs or anything," Fisher added with a smirk, earning laughs from the group. Ethan rolled his eyes, though a grin tugged at the corners of his lips. "You wish I had that kind of power." "Oh, we saw the light show," Silver teased. "Pretty sure half the camp thought the sun came up early." The boys burst into laughter, and together they made their way to the mess hall for dinner. The familiar routine of shared meals and banter felt comforting after the intense day. The food was the usual bland fare, but after the day's exertions, even the simple stew tasted heavenly. After dinner, they decided to head to the river not far from camp for a much-needed bath. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape as they trudged toward the water, their voices carrying through the cool evening air. The river's crisp water was a blessing, washing away days of sweat and grime. As they soaked, the boys began to reminisce about their homes, the villages and towns they had left behind. "Remember when we snuck into Old Man Griffin's orchard and stole those apples?" Lucas laughed, splashing water at Mark. You almost got us caught because you couldn't stop laughing. Mark snorted. Hey, those apples were worth it. Best damn apples I've ever tasted. Fisher sighed, leaning back against a smooth rock. Feels like a lifetime ago. Ethan listened quietly, the familiar stories bringing a mix of nostalgia and melancholy. I miss home, he admitted softly. But we've got to make it through this. For our families. We will, Silver said firmly. And when we get back, we'll have stories even better than stolen apples. They laughed, the weight of their situation momentarily forgotten in the warmth of their friendship. Back at the barracks, Ethan and his friends exchanged a few more jokes and stories before exhaustion pulled them into a deep sleep. But as Ethan closed his eyes, he felt a new sense of purpose settle in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about becoming stronger, for himself and for those he cared about. The next morning followed the same grueling routine. They were woken before dawn, pushed through intense physical drills, and barely had time to breathe before being shuffled to their next training. The ache in Ethan's muscles was becoming a familiar companion, but his mind was sharper, more focused. After breakfast, they were called to assemble in the center of the camp. The air buzzed with anticipation. Today, they would have to choose their specialization, the path they would focus on until their departure from the camp. The commanding officer stepped forward, his voice booming over the gathered trainees. Today, you'll decide where your strengths lie. Some of you have shown exceptional progress. Those individuals will be named and commended for their efforts. This is not just recognition. It's a challenge to keep pushing forward. The boys stood at attention, their hearts pounding in their chests. One by one, names were called. Lucas of Rivenbrook, commendable progress with the spear. The group clapped as Lucas grinned, giving Ethan a playful nudge. Mark of Rivenbrook, notable resilience and swordsmanship. Cheers erupted from their section, and Mark puffed out his chest, soaking in the attention. Fisher of Rivenbrook, excellent adaptability across multiple weapons. Fisher gave a modest nod, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. Silver of Rivenbrook, outstanding precision in archery. Silver's face lit up, and he raised his hand in acknowledgement as his friends cheered wildly. The list continued as other trainees from different villages were recognized. Aidan of Stonebridge, remarkable endurance with the long spear. Liam of Oakridge, quick reflexes and agility in swordsmanship. Darian of Highmoor, impressive control in elemental spellcasting. Nolan of Bright Hollow, strategic prowess in mixed weapon combat. Ethan's heart pounded louder with each name. He was proud of his friends, but a part of him wondered if his own efforts had been noticed. The commanding officer finally moved on to the spellcasters. A rare few among you have shown potential in magic. These individuals will be recognized for their ability to harness forces beyond the physical. Several names were called, and the newly recognized mages were summoned forward, their faces glowing with a mix of pride and nervousness. Then Ethan heard it. Ethan of Rivenbrook, commendable progress in both swordsmanship and spellcasting. For a moment he was frozen in place, his mind struggling to catch up. Lucas let out a loud whoop, slapping him on the back. Go on, mage boy, Mark teased, grinning from ear to ear. Dual threat now, huh? Silver added with a wink. Sword in one hand, spell in the other. The cheers grew louder as Ethan slowly stepped forward, his face flushing with embarrassment. He hadn't expected this. The gazes of his fellow trainees bore into him, some filled with admiration, others with envy. Standing at the front, Ethan glanced back at his friends, who were clapping and cheering like madmen. A small, shy smile crept onto his face as he nodded at them. The commanding officer raised his hand, signaling for silence. The crowd quickly quieted. From this day forward, he announced, you will focus on one or two weapons, depending on your strengths and interests. This is the time to hone your skills. Mastery in even a single field can change the course of battle, but for those with the ability, versatility can be just as powerful. The trainees nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. This wasn't just about learning to fight. It was about finding where they truly belonged on the battlefield. As the cheers finally died down, Ethan felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. He hadn't asked for this spotlight, but now that he had it, he would make sure to live up to it. Because this was just the start of something much greater. After the announcement concluded, the trainees dispersed to their respective training grounds, the excitement from the earlier recognition still lingering in the air. The sun was now fully up, casting a golden glow over the camp, but there was no time to bask in its warmth. Ethan and Mark made their way to the sword training field, where rows of wooden dummies and practice swords awaited. Around them, the other trainees were either chattering excitedly or silently preparing, their expressions a mix of determination and nervous anticipation. Some boys laughed and joked, trying to shake off their anxiety, while others, especially those from smaller, quieter villages, simply observed, their eyes darting from one potential opponent to the next. Suddenly, a commanding voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Line up!" The chatter died instantly. The trainees snapped into formation, standing shoulder to shoulder in long, uneven rows. The sound of boots stomping into position echoed across the field. A mid-rank commander strode forward, his stern gaze sweeping over them like a hawk eyeing its prey. His armor clinked faintly with each step, the metallic sound adding to the tension. "Today," he barked, "we will forge your bodies into weapons. Skill is nothing without strength and discipline. You will sweat, you will ache, and you will fail. But you will get up again. Because out there," he pointed toward the distant horizon, "failure means death." Ethan felt a shiver crawl down his spine, but he clenched his fists, ready. His body still ached from the previous days, but he knew he had to push beyond his limits. Magic might have given him an edge, but without a strong body, it meant nothing on the battlefield. The training began with relentless drills, footwork, stances, and precise strikes against the wooden dummies. The commander didn't hold back, shouting corrections and berating anyone who faltered. "You there!" he barked at a boy who stumbled. "Do you think your enemies will wait for you to catch your breath?" Ethan focused on every movement, the weight of the sword familiar but still challenging. Beside him, Mark grunted with each swing, sweat dripping down his brow, his face a mask of determination. By the time the morning sun reached its peak, their muscles were burning, and their shirts clung to their bodies, soaked with sweat. When the commander finally called for a break, Ethan felt like collapsing, but he forced himself to stand tall. This was only the beginning. Chapter 6. Lunch was a welcome reprieve. The trainees gathered in the mess area, sitting in small groups, their faces flushed from exhaustion. The smell of stew and bread filled the air, mingling with the unavoidable stench of sweat and dirt. Some trainees proudly showed off their newfound strengths, demonstrating quick sword techniques or mimicking the movements they'd learned with spears and bows. A few even attempted basic magic spells, causing small sparks or faint glimmers of light to appear in their palms, earning odd gasps from those nearby. Ethan, however, sat quietly with his meal, focused on the food in front of him. He listened to the chatter around him but didn't join in, letting his mind prepare for the next session. His body was sore, but it was his magic training in the afternoon that weighed most heavily on his mind. Mark nudged him with an elbow. "Still thinking about that light show you pulled off yesterday?" he teased with a grin. Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Just saving my energy." "You'll need it," Mark replied, stuffing a piece of bread into his mouth. "Magic's cool and all, but I'd rather have a good sword in my hand." Ethan smiled but said nothing, knowing that both were essential in the battles to come. After lunch, Ethan made his way to the mage training grounds. The area was quieter, more focused, with fewer trainees gathered in a semicircle around the instructors. The head mage from the previous day, still intrigued by Ethan's abilities, gave him a subtle nod as he approached. "Ready to see if yesterday's performance was a fluke?" The mage teased lightly, though there was a spark of genuine interest in his eyes. Ethan took a deep breath and nodded, feeling the weight of expectation settle over him. He wasn't just here to survive the training. He needed to understand what this power inside him was and how far he could push it. The afternoon sun beat down on them as they began, but Ethan was already lost in the pull of the magic within, ready to see just how much more he could unlock. As the days flew by, the intensity of their training only grew sharper, like a blade honed to perfection. Each sunrise brought new challenges, more complex attacks, defensive maneuvers, and intricate battle strategies that left the trainees exhausted but determined. Blisters turned into calluses, and muscles that once screamed in protest now moved with precision and strength. Ethan found himself adapting quickly. His swordsmanship improved with each passing day, his footwork becoming lighter, and his strikes more accurate. But it was in the mage training that his growth was truly remarkable. The flame he had conjured on his first day now burned brighter and hotter, responding to his will as if it were an extension of himself. It was now the 15th day at the camp, a milestone many hadn't believed they'd reach. That afternoon, under the scorching sun, the mage instructor gathered all the aspiring spellcasters in a shaded clearing. The air was thick with anticipation as the mage prepared to reveal each trainee's magical affinity. The group fell silent as the mage began, his voice steady and authoritative. Magic is as diverse as the elements themselves, he started, his gaze sweeping across the assembled trainees. Each of you holds a unique gift, a spark waiting to ignite. Today, you will learn what paths the arcane forces have carved for you. He turned to the first trainee, a boy with sharp features and a nervous smile. Thomas of Eldridge, the mage announced. Your affinity lies in healing. While not the strongest, your gift will be invaluable on the battlefield, mending wounds and saving lives. Thomas's face lit up with a mix of pride and relief, knowing his role would be to protect rather than destroy. Next, the mage gestured to a boy with quick, darting eyes and an easy grin. Marin of Windale, he continued. Your gift is in herb casting, enhancing natural remedies and accelerating recovery. A rare skill that will complement healers like Thomas. Marin gave a small nod, his expression calm but his eyes shining with determination. The announcements continued. Jared of Blackthorn was revealed to have a strong affinity for fire, his sparks already crackling with potential. Elric of Stonehaven showed a surprising connection to water magic, able to manipulate small streams and even conjure moisture from the air. Linas of Greymoor discovered his talent in poison magic, his spells capable of weakening foes over time, a skill that earned him curious glances from the others. Then the mage's gaze fell on Ethan. Ethan of Rivenbrook, he announced, his voice carrying an edge of intrigue. Your primary affinity is fire, but there is more. Your magic shows traces of healing and even poison attributes. Such a combination is unheard of. A murmur rippled through the group. The idea of someone mastering both destructive and restorative magics, along with the insidious art of poison, was almost unbelievable. Ethan felt the weight of their stares, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the light magic he had struggled with. Despite his rapid progress in other areas, the gentle, pure glow of light magic remained just out of his reach. Every attempt left him drained and frustrated, as if there was a barrier he couldn't break through. The mage's eyes softened slightly as he addressed Ethan directly. Your potential is vast, he said, but power without control is dangerous. Focus on what you can manage now. The rest will come with time. Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump of uncertainty in his throat. He felt a mix of pride and pressure. Having multiple affinities was rare, possibly even dangerous, but he was determined to master them all. As the group dispersed, his friends from Rivenbrook approached, their faces lit with excitement. Look at you, Ethan, Mark grinned, clapping him on the back. Fire, healing, and poison? You're practically a walking army. Silver, who had been commended for his archery skills, chuckled. Maybe you can burn our enemies, heal us, and poison anyone who gets too close. Lucas added, just don't forget about us when you become some legendary mage. They all laughed, but soon the conversation shifted as more names from Rivenbrook were mentioned during the announcements. Fisher was praised for his spear skills, showing exceptional precision and strength that surprised even the instructors. Oren, another boy from their village, displayed a knack for defensive sword techniques, making him a reliable shield in battle scenarios. Liam from Rivenbrook, though quieter than the rest, demonstrated surprising accuracy with a bow, earning respectful nods from the archery trainers. Hale, the youngest among them, managed to conjure a faint water spell, an achievement that sparked both excitement and laughter among the group, since he was more known for his clumsy ways back home. "Seems like Rivenbrook's turning into a village of champions," Mark joked, nudging Ethan. Ethan laughed, the tension easing from his shoulders. "I'll need you guys more than ever. Magic or not, we're in this together." They spent the rest of the evening training and joking, the bond between them growing stronger with each shared challenge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan knew that the days ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But for now they had each other, and that was enough. As the days marched on, tension thickened in the air like a storm about to break. There were only 4 days left before the trainees were scheduled to leave camp, but something had shifted. Whispers of sneaky monsters breaching the borders began to circulate, and the once distant sounds of battle grew closer with each night. The soldiers stationed at the perimeter returned exhausted, some wounded, their faces etched with fatigue and fear. By midday, the commanding officers gathered the trainees in the main yard. The sun blazed overhead, but even its warmth couldn't chase away the chill settling in their bones. Commander Halrick stepped forward, his usually composed face dark with concern. His voice echoed through the clearing, carrying the weight of the news. "Trainees, listen well," he bellowed. The murmurs faded into silence. "The situation at the borders has worsened. Monsters are advancing faster than anticipated. We can no longer afford to wait." A pause followed, the words sinking in. "You will depart at dawn tomorrow," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the young faces before him. "From this moment on, you are no longer just trainees. You are soldiers, soldiers of the kingdom, and soldiers fighting for your own survival." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. The reality of what they were about to face hit harder than any training exercise. "Prepare yourselves for the worst," Aldrich finished. "You'll be given the rest of the day to rest and gather your strength. Tomorrow you will meet the enemy on the battlefield." With that, the trainees were dismissed. Some stood still, processing the gravity of the announcement, while others moved away in hushed conversations. After their morning drills, they were given time to rest. But for many, rest was the last thing on their minds. Ethan sat on a log under the sparse shade of a tree, his sword resting against his leg. The thought of tomorrow's battle gnawed at him. He glanced at his friends, Mark, Lucas, Fisher, and Silver, their faces reflecting the same unease he felt. "I can't just sit around and wait," Mark muttered, gripping the hilt of his sword tightly. "We're not ready for this." "None of us are," Silver added, adjusting his quiver of arrows. "But that doesn't mean we can't get better before the sun rises." Ethan stood, brushing the dust from his trousers. "Then let's train. We've come too far to let fear stop us now." Without another word, the group moved to an empty clearing. They began to hone their skills, each focusing on their chosen weapon. Ethan practiced his sword strikes, his movements sharp and precise, while Mark mirrored him, correcting his stance with each swing. Lucas and Fisher worked with the spears, refining their thrusts and defensive maneuvers. Silver shot arrow after arrow, each one flying straighter than the last. Ethan also took time to practice his magic. He conjured small flames in his palm, trying to maintain control while pushing his limits. The heat was intense, but he welcomed the burn. It reminded him of his potential. Their determination didn't go unnoticed. Other trainees, unable to sit idle while their peers trained, began to join in. Soon, the quiet clearing was filled with the sounds of clashing weapons, grunts of effort, and the occasional crackle of magic. Oren and Liam from Rivenbrook arrived, sparring with wooden swords, their faces set with determination. Hale tried to summon more water for his fledgling spells, his brow furrowed in concentration. Even Thomas and Marin, the budding healers, practiced their magic, preparing to tend to the wounded. While many chose to train, others turned to prayer, their voices soft but sincere. They whispered to the gods for strength, courage, and the chance to see their families again. But not everyone could shake the exhaustion. Some trainees, too overwhelmed by the weight of what was to come, sought the comfort of sleep, hoping to gather their strength for the battle ahead. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the camp, Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow. His body ached, but his spirit felt stronger. Tomorrow would bring blood, fear, and danger, but it would also bring the chance to prove themselves. "We'll face whatever comes," Ethan said quietly, looking at his friends. Together, they nodded, a silent pact forged in the fires of their shared struggles. As night fell, the camp grew quiet, the only sounds the distant rustling of the forest and the faint howl of creatures beyond the borders. Tomorrow they would march into the unknown. But tonight they were still themselves, young men from Rivenbrook, standing on the edge of something far greater than any of them could have imagined. At dawn, the camp buzzed with tense energy. The once familiar grounds where the trainees had trained, laughed, and struggled were now cloaked in an eerie stillness. The sky, painted in shades of gray and orange, cast long shadows over the young soldiers as they prepared for their first taste of real battle. Ethan stood shoulder to shoulder with his friends, Mark, Lucas, Fisher, and Silver, their faces pale but resolute. The quartermasters moved through the lines, handing out weapons and shields. Ethan gripped his sword tightly, its weight both comforting and daunting. Some were given armors, simple breastplates and leather guards for added protection, though there wasn't enough for everyone. The crowd of new soldiers stirred when King Archer Verrick himself appeared atop a raised platform, flanked by his royal guard. His presence silenced the murmurs, the weight of his authority pressing down like a heavy fog. The king's armor gleamed in the early light, his regal bearing unshaken even as the reality of war loomed before them. Standing beside him was Commander Darius Halrick, their instructor and a seasoned officer known for his ruthless training methods. The long, jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw was a testament to his years on the battlefield. His cold, calculating eyes swept over the ranks of young men, but he said nothing, allowing the king to speak first. King Archer raised his hand, his voice powerful and unwavering as it echoed across the camp. "Soldiers of the kingdom," he began, his gaze firm and commanding. "You stand here today not as mere recruits, but as the shield that will protect our lands and the sword that will strike down our enemies. The kingdom calls upon your courage, your strength, and your loyalty." He paused, letting his words sink in. The weight of the moment pressed on Ethan's chest, his heart pounding in time with the king's speech. "The enemy you face is unlike any you've known. They are merciless, and they will not hesitate. But neither will we." King Alden's voice rose, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Fight for your kingdom, for your brothers in arms, and for your own survival. The kingdom stands behind you, and I expect each of you to stand tall in the face of darkness." With a final nod, the king stepped back, allowing Commander Halrick to take the stage. The commander's voice was low but cutting, carrying easily across the silent crowd. "You heard His Majesty," Halrick growled, his gaze sharp as steel. "But make no mistake, this is not a glorious march into victory. This is war. The battlefield is merciless, and it doesn't care about your rank, your family, or your fears." His eyes locked onto several soldiers, including Ethan, as if trying to gauge who would crack first. "You hesitate, you die. You falter, your comrades die. Keep your weapons ready, your wits sharper, and your hearts steady. Today, you are no longer trainees. You are soldiers." With that, Commander Halrick turned sharply, leading the soldiers toward the battlefield. The march was silent, save for the clinking of metal and the heavy steps of boots against the dirt path. As they approached the battlefield, the distant sounds of clashing steel, monstrous roars, and the agonizing cries of the wounded grew louder. When they finally arrived at the front line, the sight that greeted them was gruesome and chilling. The ground was littered with fallen soldiers, their armor dented and bloodied. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid stench of burned flesh. The monsters they faced were unlike anything Ethan had imagined. They came in all shapes and sizes: hulking brutes with twisted horns, lithe creatures with razor-sharp claws, and grotesque figures wielding crude weapons that swung mercilessly at the soldiers. Their roars reverberated through the battlefield, sending shivers down even the bravest spines. The commanders barked orders, positioning the troops in defensive formations. New mages were quickly tasked with targeting the larger monsters, their spells casting streaks of fire, ice, and lightning across the chaotic field. Then the battle began. To be continued. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and like for more. Till next time.